My family took a $3,000 vacation without me and left me to babysit for free. Left at 5 a.m., and they called CPS when they found out. Hey there, I'm Riley, a 22-year-old fresh out of college with a degree in finance. For as long as I can remember, I had this neat plan. Graduate high school, get into a good college, snag a decent job, and finally move out on my own. Sounds pretty straightforward, right? But as it turns out, life had a few surprises lined up for me. I did manage to graduate and earn that degree, but then I found myself back at my parents' place in our small Ohio town. Don't get me wrong. I love my parents, Denise and Russell. They're incredible people who created a stable environment for me and my sister Morgan. Still, moving back wasn't exactly what I had in mind after chasing my dreams for 4 years. The idea was to crash at their place for a few months while I hunted for a job and saved up enough to get my own place. It sounded perfectly sensible. I mean, free rent, homemade meals, and time to figure out my next move. It seemed like the smart choice, even if it did bruise my pride a bit. Things started off on a high note. I landed a job as an analyst at Western Group, a medium-sized company focused on financial planning for small businesses, just a week after returning home. The pay wasn't extravagant, but it was stable, and the benefits were decent. I came home that evening feeling like I had taken my first real step towards independence. Mom was busy whipping up dinner in the kitchen, while Dad was watching TV in the living room. I grabbed a plate, sat at the table, and shared the news. "I got the job," I exclaimed, beaming. "I start on Monday." For a split second, I thought they'd be thrilled, maybe offer me hugs and a "we're so proud of you." Instead, they gave each other that look, the one parents exchange when they're about to drop a bombshell. Mom set her fork down, offering a tight smile. "That's wonderful, Riley. We knew you'd snag something quickly." But then Dad piped up, "We've been meaning to talk to you about something." My stomach took a nosedive. This wasn't sounding great. Mom sighed and clasped her hands on the table. "With my arthritis worsening, I've had to cut back my hours at the library. And your dad's been getting fewer shifts at the auto shop. They're even talking about more layoffs." I knew where this was heading and asked, "Do you need some help with the bills?" Mom nodded, looking apologetic. "Just until things stabilize. You wouldn't have to pay rent, just help with utilities and groceries. We've been struggling with those." I sat there staring at my plate. I'd planned to pitch in a bit for my own expenses, but this was more than I'd expected. Still, they were my parents, and they weren't asking for much. "Sure, of course," I replied, forcing a smile. "It's the least I can do." In hindsight, that was probably when I should have set some boundaries. But guilt is one powerful emotion. Over the next 6 months, life fell into a routine. I'd wake up, head to work, come home, and crash. Every month, I'd send a sizable chunk of my paycheck to help cover the bills, groceries, and other expenses. On top of that, I'd handle small chores they claimed they couldn't tackle, like running errands for Mom when her arthritis was acting up, or fixing Dad's Excel sheets because he wasn't great with computers. It wasn't just financial support. I hadn't expected to offer up my time, energy, and patience, too. Initially, I convinced myself it was just temporary, a small gesture for parents who'd always had my back. But as time wore on, I started noticing certain things. Whenever I hinted at saving up for my own place, Mom would let out a deep sigh saying, "It must be nice to think about moving out when the rest of us are just trying to get by." Dad wasn't any different, shaking his head and commenting, "Some folks have no clue how tough it is to make ends meet." Even when I treated myself to new work clothes, it wasn't just the guilt that gnawed at me. It was the total lack of appreciation for everything I'd sacrificed. My friends stopped inviting me out because they knew I couldn't afford to join. My dream of moving to the city dimmed month by month as my savings refused to grow. When I told Mom I was thinking about taking on a second job to save up faster, she simply said, "Just make sure it doesn't interfere with what your dad and I need." That really stung. What we need. I was pouring everything I had into keeping this household running, yet it wasn't enough. But I didn't think they were being malicious. They weren't harsh or demanding, but the guilt trips kept coming, subtle yet constant, like water wearing down a stone. Meanwhile, I started feeling stuck. Initially, I'd planned to stay for 3 to 6 months tops, but the more I helped, the more they seemed to rely on me. Bills kept rolling in, and I kept footing them, while my dream of independence slipped further away. Still, I told myself it was all temporary. Just save a little more, and I'd be ready. I even started browsing city apartments, imagining what it might be like to have my own space. But then, life threw me another curveball. One Friday evening, after a long week at work, I was looking forward to a quiet night of Netflix and leftovers. Everything seemed normal. Mom in the kitchen, Dad tinkering with the lawnmower outside. That was until the doorbell rang. When I opened the door, I found my older sister Morgan looking frazzled, with her husband Travis behind her, holding a bag. Their kids, Ava and Milo, were tearing through the yard like sugar-fueled tornadoes. "Surprise!" Morgan said, her smile obviously forced. I stood there, unsure of how to respond, as Travis quietly lugged suitcases and a duffel bag inside. "What's going on?" I finally asked as Morgan breezed past me like she owned the place. "We need a place to stay for a while," she sighed, plopping onto the couch. "Travis's consulting gig ended, and my sales at the boutique have dropped. It's tough covering the rent, you know?" Except I didn't know. I couldn't fathom letting things get so bad that you just showed up unannounced at someone else's home. Travis finally managed to get through the door, obviously exhausted as he hauled all their stuff upstairs. "Hey, Riley," he mumbled, barely making eye contact before disappearing up the stairs. Still standing in place, I watched as Mom came out of the kitchen, wiping her hands on her apron. "Oh, my babies are here," she exclaimed, wrapping Morgan in a tight hug. "You poor things. You've been through so much. Don't worry. We'll take care of everything." Dad entered the scene a moment later, holding Milo like a football. "This one almost gave me a heart attack," he chuckled, running straight for the mower as if it's a ride at an amusement park. Morgan let out a faint laugh, but I noticed she didn't correct Milo or even glance his way. As I stood there, watching the scene unfold, it was like I was in some alternate reality, wondering where my own slice of life had veered off course. Within minutes, my parents were singing Morgan's praises, and I realized just how far my dreams had slipped away. So, there she was, the family's very own military hero who had miraculously come through some intense battles, yet Mom acted like nothing major had happened. She was already daydreaming aloud about dinner plans and figuring out where the kids could sleep. Meanwhile, Dad was being his usual considerate self, volunteering to shift his beloved tools from the spare room to make more room for everyone. Meanwhile, I was more like a ghost in my own home. That evening, I found myself in my room trying to concentrate on a budget spreadsheet for work. But focus was a lost cause with the utter pandemonium echoing from downstairs. Ava and Milo were tearing up and down the corridor, their screams echoing through the house. And Morgan, with her powerful voice, was filling the living room with tales of her latest business woes. I took a deep, grounding breath, reminding myself it was just a temporary situation, just a few weeks, surely manageable. But waking up the next morning shattered that hopeful illusion. Morgan and Travis had seemingly moved in for good. They emptied bags, crammed the closet in the spare room, and even commandeered a kitchen cabinet for the kids' snacks. And then came the unwelcome surprise. I was the appointed babysitter. It started innocuously enough. Morgan, with that casual air, would ask, Could you keep an eye on Ava and Milo while we make a quick store run? Quick was a relative term, though, often stretching into hours. Weekends turned into a battleground for my personal time. By Saturday morning, just as I'd brace myself for relaxation or binging some Netflix, Morgan and Travis would be all dressed up, announcing their brunch plans with friends. Morgan would leave me with a stack of printed-out kid-friendly activities, promising, "We won't be long." But not long usually stretched into nearly spending the whole day babysitting. The first time I protested, Morgan reacted like I'd just suggested something outrageous. "Riley, it's just brunch. You don't have any plans," she said, shrugging off my intention to catch up on work. "You're just on your laptop anyway. Why can't you do that with Ava and Milo around? Stop being so dramatic." And then Mom, with her subtly soft voice meant to impart age-old wisdom, chimed in, "Riley, honey, Morgan deserves a break now and then. She works so hard." I fired back with, "I work hard too," only to receive an indulgent wave-off. "Of course you do, but you're single, sweetie. You don't understand the pressures of family life." It was as if my struggles didn't quite count because I lacked a husband and kids. My pleas for boundaries came across as self-centered. Whenever Morgan and Travis swaggered back from their lengthy outings, they acted as if they'd finished a marathon. Travis once plopped onto the couch, sighing, "You don't know what it's like out there." I wanted to scream, "No idea? I spent hours keeping Milo from snacking on Play-Doh and keeping up with Ava's snack demands every 5 minutes." But voicing that seemed like whining. I often found myself spending Saturdays glued to kid shows like Bluey, dodging Milo's block throws, and fulfilling Ava's snack requests. Mom and Dad were conveniently absent during these marathon babysitting sessions, always having errands to run or garage projects to complete. When I mentioned this to Morgan later, she brushed me off. "Riley, they're just kids. It's not difficult." Easy for her to say when she wasn't the one scrubbing crayon art off the walls or explaining why Play-Doh isn't edible. The worst part? Hardly anyone acknowledged my effort. Morgan dismissed my concerns as melodramatic. Travis barely interacted with me beyond asking for favors. And Mom and Dad? They acted like all this was just par for the course. "You're such a help," Mom would say, glossing over my exhaustion with, "It's good practice for when you have kids someday." The constant guilt trips gnawed at me. Anytime I considered setting firmer boundaries, Mom's mantra echoed, "Family helps family." But what about my life? Weren't my needs important too? Plus, it wasn't just the babysitting. My paycheck, which used to comfortably cover 3, was now stretched thin, feeding and accommodating 5 more. Groceries and utilities doubled overnight. When I gently broached the topic with Morgan after dinner, asking if they could help with groceries, she looked horrified. "We're barely making it, Riley. You know that," she said, as Travis nodded sympathetically. As weeks transformed into months, my home felt more like a prison. My bedroom became my only sanctuary, yet even that was violated by Ava and Milo's random, toy-strewn invasions. It was clear to everyone but me. This was no temporary arrangement. Morgan and Travis had settled in comfortably, while I bore the financial and emotional weight. I should have stood my ground earlier, but whenever I tried, I was painted as the villain. Overreacting, selfish, that's how I was labeled, so I kept quiet. Then one evening, an unintentional eavesdrop changed everything. House walls thin enough to offer me no privacy made overhearing inevitable. Absorbed in job listings, to distract from the downstairs chaos, I caught snippets of Mom's phone chat about a trip to Florida for Celesta's retirement celebration. A family affair. Except apparently for me. A quick peek revealed Mom chatting animatedly back to me, promising my babysitting services. "Riley will be here to watch the kids," she assured casually. Reality hit like a tidal wave. I hadn't been asked. I wasn't invited. They didn't even bother to inform me. Furious, I retreated to my room, pondering the oversight. How could they disregard me so easily? In the days leading up to the trip, the house buzzed with vacation prep. Morgan flaunted new beachwear, Ava and Milo wreaked havoc, and Travis couldn't stop daydreaming about beach lounging. Left in charge, I stewed in a mix of frustration and disbelief, wondering how long I'd keep swallowing my own frustrations before finally standing up for myself. The evening kicked off with me checking and rechecking my packing essentials. Dad was on board with whatever I said, nodding along, only throwing in a rare grunt of acknowledgement when needed. Nobody seemed to touch on the fact that I wasn't going anywhere. During dinner one night, I tried to ease into the topic. So, when was anyone planning to fill me in on this Florida trip? My fork hovered over my salad. Mom looked genuinely surprised. Oh, I assumed Morgan already told you? Morgan stayed focused on her plate, barely looking up. I figured you knew. Mom's been going on about it for a while now. Weeks? My mind screamed. Weeks went by without a single heads-up my way. Attempting to keep my cool, I simply asked, "So, what's the deal? You all take off for Florida, and I hang back with the kids?" "Well, yeah," Mom replied like it was the most logical thing ever. "The kids wouldn't really enjoy a retirement party, and someone needs to be here for them. You're awesome with Ava and Milo, and besides, it's not like you'd be interested in joining us." Ouch, that stung. Why wouldn't I want to come along? I managed to say calmly. Morgan eventually tore her eyes from her plate, her face a mix of sympathy and annoyance. "It's more of a grown-ups trip, Riley. You wouldn't really know many people there besides Aunt Celeste, and it's not as if you're close or anything." Dad tried to smooth things over. "We just thought this was best for everyone. You'll have the whole house to yourself for a few days, peace and quiet." Did he seriously think looking after two hyperactive kids all weekend, while everyone else lounged on a Florida beach with margaritas, was relaxing? I ended the chat right there. Their decision was made, and no amount of talking was going to change it. As the days rolled on, I felt more and more like an outsider within my own family. The house buzzed with excitement. Morgan and Mom couldn't stop discussing outfits, itineraries, and potential dining spots down in Florida. Even Travis, usually as expressive as a doorknob, seemed unusually pumped for the trip. Meanwhile, I felt invisible. But this wasn't just about the Florida trip. Growing up, Morgan was always in the spotlight, captain of the cheerleading squad, collecting accolades, balloons, banners, you name it. Me? I was labeled the geeky one. But none of that really mattered because Morgan's trophies lined the shelves and her grin filled every family photo. Fast forward to now, not much had changed. Morgan remained the star, and I was still the backup, called upon when needed, but never truly valued. I threw myself into work as a distraction, though it was near impossible with Ava and Milo charging into my room or squabbling over toys every other minute. Morgan seemed to think parenting just meant handing the kids an iPad and letting them run amok, while Travis would simply camp out on the couch, glued to his phone amidst the chaos. Then one day, things shifted. I overheard Morgan in the kitchen talking to Mom. "It's such a blessing having Riley here. I can't imagine what we'd do without her to watch the kids. She's the glue that holds everything together." Hearing that hit me hard. Was that all I was to them? A lifeline? Not a person with dreams of my own? Just the glue they needed? That realization made it clear. I couldn't keep going on like this. I couldn't keep sacrificing my own happiness and freedom for a family that simply didn't appreciate me. I spent the following week plotting my escape. Not for revenge, but to reclaim my own life. If they could plan a trip without telling me, I could certainly plan my own. I pondered destinations, and then it clicked. Brooke, an undergrad buddy, had mentioned a camping getaway that weekend. She and some others were setting off to Blue Ridge Falls, and had invited me. I'd turned her down initially since I assumed I'd be stuck at home, but now it seemed like the perfect chance. I texted Brooke that night. "Still got room for one more on the trip this weekend?" Her reply was instant. "Of course. We're leaving early Saturday morning. You in?" I stared at my phone momentarily before replying, "I'm in." Making that decision felt exhilarating, like I was finally putting my own needs first. This wasn't just a camping trip. It was a chance to escape the madness and rediscover myself. Pulling it off, though, was going to be tricky. My family had a way of sniffing out anything happening outside their plans, and if they caught wind of me making plans for myself, those plans would be squashed instantly. I had to be strategic. The days leading up to Saturday were loaded with tension. Morgan was in full vacation mode, prancing through the house with new beach hats and blasting her trip playlist at deafening volumes. Travis spent most of his time fiddling with car seats and grumbling about the mountain of luggage that needed to fit in the trunk. Meanwhile, Mom flitted around with a clipboard, ticking off the packing list. "Riley, don't forget Ava needs her milk warmed before bed," she reminded, like I hadn't heard that 1,000 times already. "Oh, and Milo's fussy with his pajamas. The blue ones are his preference." I nodded, biting back any retort that might land me in hot water. No point arguing. I'd already signed up for the weekend babysitter gig, and nothing could persuade them otherwise. By Friday night, the place felt like a zoo. Mom and Morgan were finalizing food options. Travis was attempting to fix a squeaky luggage wheel, and the kids were zipping around the living room like tiny tornadoes. As usual, Dad had retreated to the garage, probably pretending to check tools, which I took as code for escaping the chaos. Observing it all from the kitchen with a cup of tea, I silently counted down the hours until morning. Around 10 p.m., the house finally settled down. Mom tucked the kids in. Morgan went upstairs to finish packing her last-minute items, and Travis sprawled on the couch, engrossed in his phone. I waited until the house was completely still before sneaking to my room and grabbing my duffel bag. Slowly, I'd been packing all week to avoid raising any eyebrows, stashing my hiking boots and clothes at the back of my closet. I meticulously packed my toothbrush, flashlight, and a few snacks before sealing the bag shut. My heart raced with anticipation, not fear. This wasn't just a camping trip. It was a path to regaining control over my life. At precisely 5 a.m., my alarm sounded, and I sprung into action, grabbing my duffel and tiptoeing to the door. The house was eerily quiet, the kind of silence only found in the early morning. Holding my breath, I swung the front door open, wincing at its unexpected creakiness. I paused, waiting for a voice to halt me, but all was still. The outside air was as crisp and refreshing. One final glance at the sleepy house, and I got into my car and started it. As I backed out of the driveway, a wave of calm washed over me. I was finally free. The drive to Blue Ridge Falls felt like a new beginning, a chance to break free from the chaos that had taken over my life. Heading out on my trip, I felt a sense of peace and calm descend upon me. The further I got from home, the more the burden seemed to lift off my shoulders. I switched on the radio, letting the music wash over me, and I realized it was the first time I'd truly relaxed in what felt like ages. Although thoughts of how my family would react when they noticed I was gone flitted through my mind, I quickly pushed them aside. This trip was all about focusing on me for a change. My friend Brooke had sent me the GPS coordinates for the camping spot, and by the time I arrived, the sun was shining brightly in the sky. She was already there, busily unloading her car and setting up her tent. "Hey, you made it!" she called out with enthusiasm, waving at me as I pulled up next to her. "Of course," I replied, grinning. "I wouldn't miss it for the world." The campsite was perfect, just enough solitude to feel like a real getaway. yet not so far off the beaten path that we couldn't find a couple of decent hiking trails. Brooke introduced me to the rest of the group, which was a mix of her college buddies and a few of her co-workers. They all seemed laid back and friendly, with no one prying too much into personal details. We spent the morning setting up our tents, gathering firewood, and mapping out which hiking paths we wanted to tackle. By the time noon rolled around, we'd ventured deep into the woods. It felt so refreshing to be surrounded by nature rather than the constant noise and chaos of daily life. Brooke and I fell into an easy rhythm, chatting about work, life, and everything in between. She didn't ask about my family, and honestly, I wasn't inclined to bring them up. This getaway was for me, and me alone. That evening, as we gathered around the campfire roasting marshmallows and sharing stories, I realized just how much I needed this break. "This is exactly what I needed," I sighed, contentedly, leaning back in my camp chair and soaking up the warmth from the fire. "Same here," Brooke agreed, tossing another log onto the fire. "We should definitely do this more often. Just escape from everything, you know?" I nodded, mesmerized by the flames. For the first time in forever, I felt genuinely relaxed. Nobody was asking me to do them favors. Nobody was guilt-tripping me, and no one was demanding my time and energy for their own gain. As the night wore on, I found myself laughing more than I had in years. It wasn't just the jokes or funny stories. It was the sheer joy of being surrounded by people who didn't expect anything from me. During this entire time, I didn't even check my phone once. When we finally made our way back to the campsite that evening, I felt an exhilarating fatigue. My legs were sore, my face slightly sunburnt, but my heart felt as light as it had in months. I didn't care about what my family might expect of me or their usual demands. I was pondering what I truly wanted out of life, where I was headed, and how I planned to get there. At least, that's how I felt until I walked through my front door. The house was in complete disarray. Toy dinosaurs, crayons, and an empty cereal bag were scattered across the couch. The faint smell of something burnt lingered in the air, and I could hear voices coming from the living room. "Riley's here, I hear," Ard Mom say, her voice lacking its usual warmth. It was sharp, like she was on the brink of a confrontation. I dropped my duffel bag by the door and walked into the living room. There they were, Mom, Morgan, Travis, and Dad, all seated with expressions of anger and frustration etched on their faces. Ava was crying loudly, and Milo was huddled on the floor with a juice box. "What's going on?" I asked, striving to keep my voice steady. "What's going on?" Morgan practically shouted, jumping to her feet and pointing at me. "You vanished without telling anyone. That's what's going on. I told you I wasn't babysitting this weekend." I crossed my arms, feeling a surge of defiance. "You didn't tell us where you were or what the hell you were doing," Mom yelled, her face turning red. "I'm an adult. I don't need to check in," I retorted, feeling my patience wearing thin. "Well, when we saw you weren't here with the kids, we panicked," Travis chimed in. Panic didn't even begin to cover it. They said they were shocked to find me gone on Saturday morning. My car missing, my room empty, no note left behind. Instead of assuming I'd taken a much-needed break, they jumped to the worst conclusions. "We thought something happened to you," Mom said, her voice trembling slightly. "We even called CPS." I was stunned. "You called CPS? For what?" "For abandoning the kids," Morgan explained, as though it was the most obvious thing in the world. "First of all," I said, waving my hand to cut her off, "I never agreed to watch your kids this weekend. You all decided that on your own, without my input. Second, calling CPS on me for not being here is ridiculous. What exactly did you tell them? Hi, we wanted to leave our own kids with someone who didn't agree to it, but now she's not home, so please come arrest her." "Did they laugh before or after they hung up on you? That's insane." Mom fired back, saying it wasn't absurd when they had no idea where I was. I couldn't handle their nonsense anymore. So, what did CPS do when they showed up? I asked. They left after we explained everything, Morgan admitted quietly. But do you know how embarrassing that was? Embarrassing? I echoed, my voice incredulous. You called CPS because I didn't stay to babysit? And you're worried about embarrassment? The argument only intensified from there. Morgan accused me of being selfish and irresponsible, while Travis chimed in about how I had let everyone down. Mom kept going on about how I had deserted my family. Dad, of course, just sat there, shaking his head in disappointment, as was his habit when things didn't go according to his plan. By the end of the argument, I was too drained to fight anymore. I grabbed my duffel bag and headed upstairs to my room, slamming the door behind me. The tension lingered through the weekend and into Monday. I left for work early, wanting to avoid more guilt trips or accusations. But my phone was already bombarded with texts. Mom wanting to talk about my behavior, Morgan accusing me of screwing them over, and Travis saying I owed the family an apology. I ignored them all. At work, I attempted to concentrate, but the stress from the weekend hovered over me like a dark cloud. My coworkers could tell something was amiss, but the last thing I wanted was to spill my family drama in the break room. By the time I got home that evening, I was bracing myself for another round. Mom was waiting for me in the kitchen as soon as I walked in. "We need to talk," she said, crossing her arms. "I'm tired," I replied wearily, trying to pass by. "Riley," she insisted, stepping in front of me. "This can't wait." I sighed, setting my bag down. "What now?" Mom's expression softened, but her tone stayed firm. "Your sister feels hurt. She thinks you abandoned her when she needed you most." I stared at her, flabbergasted. "Needed me for what? To babysit while she goes on vacation? That's not my responsibility, Mom." "You should do your part as a member of this family," she said, her voice tinged with frustration. "Funny how that only seems to apply to me," I shot back. "When has Morgan ever been there for me? When has anyone been there for me?" Mom opened her mouth, but no words came out. "Exactly," I said, picking up my suitcase and heading upstairs. The tension in the house was palpable for the next few days. Morgan barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was only to make snide remarks about finding reliable babysitters. Travis wisely stayed out of it, but his silence was almost as unsettling as the arguments. Mom and Dad tried to act as if everything was normal, but it was far from it. It seemed like nothing had happened, yet every chat we had was dripping with regret and things left unsaid. "We're a family," Mom would randomly remind us, as if saying it could magically fix everything. But I was starting to get the feeling that I couldn't stick around much longer. The house felt more stifling than ever, and no amount of time or space seemed to make things any better. One night, as I was folding laundry, Dad knocked on my door. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quieter than usual. "Sure," I replied, even though I was bracing myself for yet another lecture. He came in, sat at the edge of my bed, and stared at his hands. "Look, I know things have been rough lately, and I get that you might feel like we haven't been fair to you," he started. I sat there in silence, waiting for him to go on. "Your mom and we're just trying to hold this family together," he added. "We've been through a lot, and we're all just doing our best." "Dad, I get it," I said, doing my best to keep my cool. "But I can't just keep putting my life on the back burner for everyone else. I'm 22. I should be starting my future, not spending my days looking after Morgan and Travis." He nodded, though I could tell he didn't fully grasp what I was saying. "We'll figure this out," he finally said, after a long pause. "Just give it some time." I nodded, but deep down, I knew that time alone wouldn't solve anything. By the end of that week, I made up my mind. It was time to leave. The house felt more like a battleground than a home, and if I stayed much longer, I feared I'd lose what little sanity I had remaining. Despite having spent months paying for bills that weren't mine, my savings were enough to get me started. I found a few apartment listings that seemed promising. They weren't anything special, just small and clean. Before calling to inquire, I looked at my phone and decided to ring Aunt Celeste. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm and full of empathy. "Riley, how are you, sweetheart?" she asked. "Hey, Aunt Celeste, I'm okay, I guess," I replied, unsure of how to break the news to her. Picking up on my hesitation, she asked, "What's going on? Is everything all right?" "Not really," I confessed. "I don't know if you heard, but I didn't go on your retirement trip." "I noticed," she said. "Your mom said you were staying to help with the kids. I thought that sounded odd. Why didn't you come?" I couldn't help but let out a bitter laugh. "Because no one even told me about it. They just assumed I'd stay and babysit, like always." Aunt Celeste was quiet for a moment before she let out a deep breath. "That doesn't surprise me, unfortunately. Your mom mentioned how much you've been helping out, but it sounds like they're taking advantage of you." "Yeah, you could say that," I admitted. "I'm actually thinking about moving out, but I'm not sure how to handle the fallout." "Well, sweetheart, you've done more than enough," she reassured me. "You're young. You shouldn't be tied down like this. Move out, set boundaries, and let them figure out their own mess. It's not up to you to fix everything for them." Hearing those words lifted a huge weight off my shoulders. She added firmly, "And if you need any help, let me know. You deserve better than this." That conversation was the motivation I needed. The next morning, I informed the landlord that I wouldn't be paying rent starting the following month and that my parents would need to take over. It was a step I hesitated to take, but knew was necessary. After that, I spent the day packing. I didn't bother telling anyone. I wasn't ready for another argument until it was time to go. I packed as much as I could into my car. The rest would have to wait. That evening at dinner, I was ready to drop the bomb. The atmosphere was already tense. Morgan hadn't been speaking to me all week, and Mom hovered around like a storm cloud. "Can we talk?" I asked as I set down my fork. Mom looked up, her expression wary. "What is it, Riley?" she asked. Plainly, I said, "I'm moving out." The silence was deafening. Morgan's fork clanked against her plate, and Mom's jaw fell open. Even Dad looked surprised, though he quickly masked it with a grin. "You're what?" Mom asked, her voice trembling. "I'm moving out," I repeated. "I've already found a place, and I'll be leaving by the weekend." "But you can't just leave," Mom protested, her voice rising. "We need you here, for the bills, the kids." "It's not my responsibility," I told her. "I've been paying for this house, looking after Morgan's kids, and putting my own life on hold for months. It's time for me to live my own life." Morgan scoffed. "Wow! So you're just going to abandon us? How selfish can you be?" Turning to her, I replied, my patience worn thin. "Selfish, Morgan? You've been living here, rent-free, dropping your kids on me every chance you get, and contributing absolutely nothing. If anyone's selfish, it's you." "That's enough, Riley," Dad interjected sternly. "No, it's not enough," I retorted. "I've done everything you've asked and more, and all I've gotten in return are guilt trips and disrespect. I'm done." Mom's face fell, but I stood firm. "I've already told the landlord that I won't be paying rent anymore," I said. "So you'll need to figure that out too." Morgan looked as though she was about to explode. "Are you kidding me? You're just going to leave us with all the bills? How are we supposed to manage without you?" "Not my problem," I said, echoing her own words from months before. The next morning I loaded the rest of my belongings into my car. Mom stood on the porch looking sad, but she didn't say a word. Dad stayed inside, avoiding the scene altogether. Morgan didn't even bother to come downstairs. As I pulled out of the driveway, I felt a whirlwind of emotions, but above all, I felt free. In the first few days at my new apartment, everything felt surreal. Mom called several times, but I wasn't ready to talk, so I didn't pick up. Morgan sent me a flurry of angry texts accusing me of abandoning the family, so I blocked her number. Aunt Celeste checked in with me. "I'm proud of you, sweetheart," she said. It's not easy standing up for yourself, especially with family, but you did the right thing." "Thanks, Aunt Celeste," I said, smiling. "I think so too." It's been a few months now, and things are starting to feel normal again. I've reconnected with old friends, started new hobbies, and have even begun saving up for a trip to Europe next year. I've kept my distance from my family. Mom occasionally sends guilt-ridden texts, but I no longer let them get to me. Morgan and I haven't spoken since I left, and I'm okay with that. I realize they need to make some changes, but it's not my job anymore, and I've spent too much of my life putting them first. It's time to prioritize myself for a change. And you know what? I don't regret it one bit. Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoy hearing stories like mine, don't forget to subscribe. See you next time.